Dad, I need you to listen and not overreact. We signed the term sheet this morning. Mercer Industrial is being sold to Apex Group. The deal closes in 30 days. Your shares will be bought out at fair market value, and you can finally enjoy your retirement. I suggest you don't make this difficult. My son Nathan hung up before I could swallow the sip of coffee I was holding. He thought he had won. He thought the word retirement was a cage I had walked into willingly, one I couldn't climb out of. He thought 35 years of blood and calluses and missed birthdays were just a line item on a balance sheet that he could liquidate whenever the numbers suited him. I set the mug down on my kitchen table and looked out at the oak tree in the backyard, the one I planted the year Nathan was born. It was old now, thick-trunked and immovable, and it had survived every storm this county had thrown at it for 32 years. I picked up my phone. I didn't call Nathan back. I called Gerald. Before I tell you how I turned my son's victory parade into a funeral march, I want you to subscribe to this channel and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Hit the like button if you believe that loyalty isn't something you inherit. It's something you earn. My name is Frank Mercer. I'm 66 years old. I built Mercer Industrial with my hands, my wife's faith, and a second mortgage on a house we could barely afford. We made precision machine components for the aerospace industry, and we were good at it. By the time I stepped back 4 years ago, the company was pulling $42 million a year and employed close to 200 people, most of them from our county. I handed the keys to Nathan because I loved him, and because I trusted him, and because my wife Sandra had made me promise, right before she passed, that I would give him the chance she always believed he deserved. That was 3 years ago. I honored that promise completely. What I didn't expect was that Nathan would spend those 3 years treating Mercer Industrial like his personal ATM machine, running up executive perks, hiring his college friends into positions they had no business filling, and quietly shopping the company to every private equity vulture who came sniffing around the valley. I had stepped back, but I hadn't gone blind. I heard the rumors through the shop floor. One of my oldest machinists, a man named Dwight who had worked for me since the beginning, called me on a Tuesday evening the way he always did when something was wrong. He didn't mince words. He told me Nathan had been flying out to meetings in Chicago and Dallas, that a law firm nobody recognized had been spotted in the building, that the finance director, a young woman Nathan had hired over my objection, had been shredding documents in the back office at 7 in the morning. I thanked Dwight and told him to keep his head down and his mouth shut. Then I called Gerald. Gerald Ashby and I had gone to law school in the same town, though neither of us went to law school. He was the kind of attorney who wore his suits like armor and his silence like a weapon. He had helped me incorporate Mercer Industrial in the very beginning, back when the company was just an idea I had sketched on a napkin in a diner booth. He knew every word of the founding documents because he had written most of them. Gerald, I said when he picked up, do you remember the Class B provisions? There was a pause. The kind of pause that means a man is sitting up straighter. The original articles? From 1989? From 1989. I confirmed. He was quiet for a long moment. Frank, he finally said, does your son know? I don't think he ever read them, I replied. Another pause. Then, you want to come in? I'll be there in an hour. I drove to Gerald's office on the edge of town, a brick building that smelled like old coffee and certainty. He had the original incorporation documents out on his conference table by the time I arrived, the physical copies, the ones with the embossed seal, and the original signatures still visible in blue ink from 35 years ago. Gerald sat across from me with his reading glasses on the end of his nose and tapped a specific paragraph near the back of the document. His finger rested on it the way a man's finger rests on a loaded trigger. Class B founder shares, he read, held exclusively by Francis Howard Mercer, carry a 10-to-1 voting weight on all matters of corporate control, including, but not limited to, merger, acquisition, dissolution, or transfer of controlling interest. Any transaction requiring a change of controlling ownership is void without the written, notarized consent of the Class B shareholder. I looked at the paragraph I had insisted on including 35 years ago. Back then, my own father had warned me about partners and promises, and even though I'd had no partners, I had listened to the spirit of his advice. I had built the lock into the foundation of the house before I ever let anyone else walk through the door. Nathan held Class A shares. He had operational authority, dividend rights, the ability to run the company day to day, but control of the company in any absolute sense. The power to sell it, merge it, dissolve it. That had always remained with me. He inherited the keys to the car, I said. But I kept the title. Gerald took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. He looked at me the way people look at a man they thought they knew but are now seeing clearly for the first time. You built this in from the beginning, he said. Even when you transferred your operational shares to Nathan last year, you never transferred the Class B position. I transferred what I meant to transfer, I replied. Not a word more. Gerald leaned back in his chair. Frank, if Nathan has signed a term sheet with Apex Group, and if Apex has any kind of competent legal team, they ran a title check on the share structure. I know, I said. So why didn't they find the Class B provision? Gerald turned to page 47 of the original document. The Class B provision was listed under a section titled Additional Governance Provisions, buried between a paragraph about annual reporting requirements and a boilerplate indemnification clause. It was not prominently labeled. It was not summarized in the table of contents. It had been drafted in the deliberate, understated language of a man who didn't want it found easily, because whoever they sent to look at the articles was looking for the standard stuff, Gerald said slowly. Voting rights, share classes, transfer restrictions. They probably found the Class A structure Nathan holds and stopped there. They didn't dig to page 47. They should have, I said. Gerald looked at me across the table. Frank, he said my name carefully, the way a man says a name when he's about to ask a serious question. If Nathan closes this deal, Apex pays him for a controlling interest he doesn't legally have the authority to sell. The transaction is void. Nathan has committed fraud. I didn't say anything. I just looked at the oak grain of the conference table. Gerald continued. If you want to stop this now, I can send a letter to Apex's legal counsel today. The deal dies quietly. Nathan gets embarrassed, but he doesn't go to prison. If you wait and let the money transfer, his voice trailed off. How long before closing? I asked. 30 days, Gerald said. The term sheet Nathan signed sets the closing date for the last business day of the month. I stood up from the conference table and walked to the window. Outside, the parking lot was ordinary and gray and quiet. A woman was loading groceries into a minivan. A dog was waiting patiently on a leash tied to a stop sign. The world was proceeding without any knowledge of the war that had just been declared inside this room. Don't send the letter, I said. Gerald was quiet. I need to understand why he's doing this, I said. That week, I called in a favor from an old contact named Ray, a man I had used twice in 30 years, both times when I suspected something I could not prove through ordinary means. Ray was the kind of man who could find the bottom of any lake. What Ray brought me 4 days later was worse than I expected and, in the strangest way, exactly what I needed to hear. Nathan owed money. Not the manageable kind. The dangerous kind. He had quietly taken out a personal loan against his Class A shares 2 years ago, using an offshore lending arrangement that charged interest rates I wouldn't have believed if I hadn't seen the statements myself. He had sunk that money into a series of speculative tech investments that had collapsed the year before. He had tried to recover the losses by doubling down on a venture capital fund that turned out to be, in Ray's careful language, legally ambiguous. The total exposure was somewhere north of $8 million. The lenders were not the kind of people who sent registered letters. They were the kind of people who sent messages of a different sort. The sale of Mercer Industrial to Apex Group was valued at $38 million. Nathan's Class A position represented roughly 70% of that, approximately $26 million. Enough to make the problem disappear and still walk away wealthy. He wasn't selling the company out of ambition. He was selling it to survive. I sat in my living room that night with Ray's report on my lap and Sandra's photograph on the shelf across from me. She was laughing in the picture, taken at the company's 20th anniversary party, her arm around my shoulders, her head tilted back the way it always was when she was genuinely happy. "I'm sorry, Sandra," I said to the room. "I'm sorry. I didn't see this earlier." But I wasn't crying, because I also remembered what Sandra used to say about our son when he was young and getting himself into trouble. She would look at me with that clear-eyed certainty of hers and say, "Frank, the kindest thing you can do for someone you love is hold them responsible." I pulled out my phone and called Gerald. "We're letting the deal proceed," I told him. There was a long silence. "Frank," Gerald said carefully, "if we let it close and then invoke the Class B provision, Nathan won't just lose the sale. He'll face civil liability to Apex for fraudulent misrepresentation, potentially criminal exposure." "I know," I said. "Do you understand what that means for him?" "I understand what it means for him if we stop it now, too," I said. "He walks away from $8 million in debt with no consequence. He learns nothing. He tries it again. Time. 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 Frank, he sold the company, Gerald," I said. "He sold what 200 people built with their hands without asking any of them. He sold his mother's legacy without even mentioning her name. He called me to inform me, not to discuss it. He used the word overreact, like I was an inconvenience he was managing. I wasn't shouting. My voice was very quiet. "Hold the Class B provision," I said. "Let the deal close. Let the money transfer. Then we invoke it." Gerald took a long breath. "All right, Frank. But when we move fast." 30 days passed like a slowly tightening wire. I watched from a careful distance. Ray kept me updated on the movements of the transaction. The due diligence teams came and went. Nathan signed documents. Apex's attorneys reviewed the articles for a second time and still didn't find page 47. The finance director continued to work late. The shop floor hummed with a tension that the workers couldn't name but could feel. On the 28th day, I drove past the building at 6 in the morning. The parking lot was full of cars that didn't belong to anyone I recognized. Apex people. They were already acting like they owned the place, moving through my building in their pressed shirts and visitor badges, measuring the walls with their eyes. I drove home and called Dwight. I told him to make sure the guys knew that whatever happened in the next week, their jobs were protected. That Mercer Industrial wasn't going anywhere. He didn't ask me how I knew that. He just said, "Yes, sir," the way he always had. On the 30th day, the wire transfer cleared. $26 million landed in Nathan's account at 3:14 inches the afternoon. By 3:47, he had already moved $4 million of it to pay off the most urgent creditors. I know the exact time, because Ray was watching. At 4:30, I called Gerald. "It's time," I said. Gerald filed the Class B invocation with the Delaware Secretary of State's office at 5:01 p.m. He simultaneously sent formal notice to Apex Group's legal counsel, certified mail and email, informing them that the sale of Mercer Industrial had proceeded without the legally required consent of the Class B shareholder and was therefore void under the terms of the original Articles of Incorporation. He attached all 47 pages. Then he sent a second letter to Nathan. I drove to the diner on Route 9 and ordered a cup of black coffee and a slice of pie I didn't eat. I sat in the corner booth and watched the sun go down over the parking lot and thought about the oak tree I had planted the year my son was born. Gerald arrived at 7 o'clock and slid into the booth across from me. He didn't look like a man delivering good news. He looked like a man who had just started a fire and was watching it spread in a direction nobody had expected. "Apex's legal team called within 30 minutes of receiving our notice," he said. "They are not happy, Frank. They are significantly not happy." "I imagine they're not," I said. "They've already reached out to their forensic accountants. By morning, they'll have the full picture." Nathan signed representations and warranties at closing, stating that the share structure gave him unencumbered authority to execute the transaction. He signed those under penalty of fraud. "He didn't know about the Class B provision," I said. Gerald looked at me over his coffee. "Frank, not knowing is not a defense when you're the CEO of a company and you've signed a contract certifying that you do know. He had a fiduciary obligation to verify his own authority before he executed a $38 million transaction. His ignorance isn't a shield. It's an additional charge. We sat in silence for a moment. What about the money he's already distributed? I asked. Apex will go after every dollar, Gerald said. The $4 million he paid out to creditors, they'll claw it back if they can. Whatever's left in the account will be frozen by morning. Their legal team has already moved for an emergency injunction. By the time Nathan wakes up tomorrow, he will have $26 million on paper and approximately nothing he can actually touch. I drank my coffee. It was too hot and too bitter, and it tasted exactly like what I needed. The next morning was clear and cold, the kind of October morning that makes the air feel sharp and honest. I drove to Mercer Industrial at 7:30. I was wearing a charcoal jacket and a tie I hadn't worn in 4 years. My shoes were polished. My hands were steady. Gerald was already in the parking lot when I arrived. Behind him was a third car, belonging to David Owens, a partner from the firm that handled our corporate litigation. David was carrying a briefcase and wearing the expression of a man who had slept 4 hours and was ready to work 12 more. 2 cars I didn't recognize were parked near the front entrance. Apex people, already on site. Nathan's truck was in its usual space near the door marked CEO, the space that used to say founder. I walked through the front entrance. The receptionist, a young woman named Carla, who had worked there for 2 years and had always been kind to me on my visits, looked up and her eyes went wide. "Mr. Mercer," she said, as if she was seeing a ghost. "Good morning, Carla," I said. "Is my son in his office?" "He's in the conference room," she said quietly, "with some people from Apex." "Thank you," I said. The hallway to the main conference room passed the shop floor, and through the safety glass windows I could see the machinists at their stations. Dwight was at his bench near the far wall. He looked up when I walked past. He gave me a slow nod. I nodded back. I pushed open the conference room door. Nathan was at the head of the table, which had been his habit ever since I gave him the title. He was wearing a suit that was newer and more expensive than anything he would have bought on his salary before the wire transfer cleared. Across from him sat 2 attorneys from Apex, and a man I recognized as their regional vice president, a sharp-faced individual named Collins, who had the permanent expression of someone calculating the cost of everything around him. They all looked up when I walked in. Nathan's face went through several transformations in about 2 seconds. Surprise, then something close to irritation, then something he was trying very hard to keep from becoming fear. "Dad," he said, "this isn't a good time." "I disagree," I said. "I think the timing is exactly right." Gerald and David filed in behind me. David placed his briefcase on the table and opened it with the calm efficiency of a man who had done this before. Collins looked at Gerald, then at me, then at the briefcase. "Who are you?" Collins asked Gerald, not rudely, but directly. "Gerald Ashby," Gerald said. "I represent Phoenix Class Holdings, which is the administrative entity for the Class B shares of Mercer Industrial, held by Mr. Frank Mercer, since the company's founding in 1989. Nathan set down his coffee cup. "What are you talking about?" Collins had already turned to his own attorney, a woman named Patterson, who had the look of someone who was rapidly doing calculations in her head. "The Class B provision," Patterson said quietly to Collins. "It was in the articles. We missed it." Collins turned to Nathan. His expression was no longer that of a business partner. It was the expression of a man looking at someone who has just cost him an enormous amount of money. "What Class B provision?" Nathan said. He looked at me. "Dad, what is this? You retired. You signed over your shares." "I signed over my Class A shares," I said. "I signed over the operational equity, and the dividend rights, and the management authority. I've been stepping back since Sandra passed. But I never signed over the Class B position. Nobody asked me to. Nobody thought to check whether they should." The room was very quiet. I sat down at the other end of the table, the end where the founder sits, and I placed my hands flat on the surface. "Nathan," I said, "I built this company before you were old enough to hold a wrench. I drove this equipment myself when we couldn't afford operators. I signed personal guarantees on loans that would have taken our house if I'd gotten it wrong. I named this company after our family because I believed it would stand for something. And then I handed it to you because your mother believed in you with everything she had. Nathan's jaw was tight. He was looking at the table. What you did, I continued, was take what she believed in and try to sell it without my knowledge. Without the consent of 200 employees who have mortgages and children and lives built around this place, and without the legal authority to do so. You signed closing documents certifying that you had clear title to execute this transaction. You didn't. Nathan looked up. His eyes were hard and defensive. Dad, the company needed this. I needed this. Do you know what it costs to run a manufacturing operation in this environment? Do you know how far behind we are on capital investment? Apex has resources we don't. This was the right move strategically. David from our litigation firm slid a document across the table to Collins. This is the Class B invocation filed yesterday with the Secretary of State, David said. You'll also want to look at pages 12 through 15, which outline the fraud exposure under the representations and warranties your client signed at closing. Collins picked up the document. He read for approximately 45 seconds and then set it down with the careful deliberateness of someone who does not want to show how hard he has just been hit. Nathan, I said, you also told me on the phone that my shares would be bought out at fair market value. But you didn't ask me if I wanted to sell. You informed me, the same way you informed Dwight and the other shop foremen, the same way you informed the customers who have worked with us for 20 years. You made a decision that wasn't entirely yours to make, and you made it in secret. And when it was done, you called me as a courtesy. He started to respond, and I raised one hand slightly. I'm not here to argue with you, I said. I'm here because Gerald needs you to be present when we serve these documents. And because I wanted to look you in the eye when I told you that the transaction is void. The Apex Vice President, Collins, stood up slowly. He buttoned his jacket. He looked at Nathan the way a creditor looks at a debtor. Your father has invoked a governance provision that invalidates the sale, Collins said, his voice flat and professional. We transferred $26 million to your account yesterday, based on your certified representation that you held unencumbered authority to execute this transaction. You did not hold that authority. We are moving to claw back every dollar. We are also referring this matter to our litigation department, and I would strongly suggest you retain criminal counsel before the end of business today. Nathan's face had gone the color of old concrete. Wait, he said. Wait a minute. He turned to me. Dad, you can fix this. You can sign a retroactive consent. One signature and the transaction stands. Apex gets their acquisition. I get the funds. And we all move on. You don't even have to like it. Just sign the paper. I looked at my son across the table where we had eaten birthday cake when the company turned 10, where we had gathered after Sandra's funeral and made toasts with paper cups of bad coffee. The version of me that loved that memory wanted to reach for a pen. Nathan, I said, do you remember what I told you the day you took over the CEO chair? He shook his head slightly. I told you that I was handing you the work of my hands, I said. I told you that the people on that shop floor weren't employees to me. They were the reason this company existed. I told you that every decision you made would carry the weight of their livelihoods. I told you to read every document before you signed it, and to call me before you made any decision you couldn't reverse. His eyes dropped. You didn't call, Nathan. Dad, please. You went to Chicago. You went to Dallas. You found a buyer in secret, and you negotiated a sale in secret, and you called me 30 days before closing to inform me of a decision you had already made. And when I asked you not to make this difficult, that was your word. Difficult. You hung up the phone. I'm sorry, he said. His voice cracked slightly. I'm sorry, Dad. I was drowning. The debts. The lending arrangement. I made bad decisions and the interest was compounding and I didn't know how to come to you because you would have been disappointed and I couldn't stand that. I couldn't stand watching you look at me the way you used to look at the guys we had to let go. The room was entirely still. I should have come to you, he continued. I know that. I know it now. But please don't let them do this. Please, just sign the consent. Let the deal go through. I will pay back whatever you think is fair. I will pay you back every dollar. I promise." I was quiet for a long moment. And then I said, "I know you mean that right now." He looked up. "I know that in this room, at this table, with these people watching, you mean every word of it," I said. "And I know that if I hand you the pen and let you walk out of here with $26 million and a lesson that your father will always catch you when you fall, you will mean it a little less next year, and considerably less the year after that." "Nathan," I said, "your mother made me promise to give you every chance she believed you deserved. I have kept that promise." I stepped back. "I gave you the company. I gave you the chair and the title and the trust. This is what you did with it." I stood up from the table. "I will not sign the consent," I said. "The transaction is void. Gerald will work with Apex's counsel on the clawback. Whatever criminal exposure comes from the representations and warranties you signed, that is between you, your attorney, and the legal system." I picked up my jacket from the back of the chair. "Mercer Industrial belongs to this family and to these people," I said, gesturing toward the shop floor windows, where I could see the outline of Dwight still at his bench. "It is not a number on a term sheet. It is not a tool for covering your mistakes. I'm not going to let you sell it to the people who made your problems, using the authority of people who didn't give it to you." I walked to the door. I stopped with my hand on the frame. "When you're ready to talk," I said. "Not about the money, not about the deal, just to talk. Call me. I'll answer." I walked out. In the hallway, Carla was standing near the reception desk, pretending to organize papers. Her eyes were red. She had heard enough. I stopped beside her. "Your job is fine," I told her. "Everybody's job is fine." She pressed her lips together and nodded and looked down at her desk. I walked through the shop floor on the way out, something I hadn't done in 4 months. I walked past the CNC machines and the quality inspection stations and the part storage racks that stretched to the ceiling. I nodded to every person I passed. Most of them nodded back. Some of them said, "Good morning, Mr. Mercer." Dwight fell into step beside me near the far door. He didn't ask any questions. He just walked with me the way he always had, the way a man walks beside someone he's known long enough to understand their silences. "We good?" he said when we reached the exit. "We're good," I said. He pushed the door open for me, and the cold October air came in sharp and clean. 3 weeks later, Gerald settled the civil matter with Apex Group. The clawback was substantial. Nathan retained enough to resolve his most immediate debts, but very little beyond that. He was not criminally charged, primarily because his exposure under the warranty fraud was difficult to prove as intentional rather than negligent, and Gerald worked quietly on his behalf, in a way I had asked him to and never told Nathan about. Mercer Industrial did not sell. Apex moved on to other acquisitions. The shop floor ran a full shift the week after everything settled. I drove out on a Wednesday afternoon and stood in the parking lot for a while and watched the trucks pulling in and out, the machinists on their smoke breaks, the same ordinary motion of a working place that I had watched for 30 years. Dwight came out to meet me. "You coming back in?" he asked. "Not permanently," I said. "But maybe for a while." He considered this. "We could use someone who remembers how to read a blueprint." "I still know how," I said. He smiled, which was rare for Dwight, and held the door open. I went back inside. Nathan called me 6 days after the settlement. I answered on the second ring. We talked for a long time. Not about the money, not about the deal, about Sandra, mostly. About the years before everything got complicated, about what she would have said if she had been there in that conference room. He cried at one point. I let him. I didn't tell him it was going to be all right, because I didn't know if it was. But I told him that the door was open, and that the word family was not a bailout, but it also wasn't a door that only swings one way. I meant both of those things. There is a kind of love that enables the worst in people and calls itself devotion. It rescues them before the consequence arrives and wonders why they never seem to learn. I spent most of my life giving that kind of love, and I thought I was being a good father. The hardest thing I ever did was let my son stand in the consequence of what he chose. Not because I stopped loving him, because I refused to stop respecting him. I refused to treat him like someone too weak to survive what he had earned. You can rebuild a balance sheet. You can renegotiate a debt. But you cannot buy back the self-respect of someone who has never been held responsible for the cost of their choices. And you cannot build a real relationship with anyone. Not a business partner, not a friend, not a child, on a foundation of rescue. If you believe that real love sometimes means holding the line, hit the like button and subscribe to this channel. And if you have ever had to make a choice between mercy and accountability with someone you love, tell me your story in the comments. I read every one. Until next time, stay standing.